the stench hit you first. A nauseating cocktail of human waste, rotting straw, and death that permeated every stone of the Conciergerie prison. But nothing could prepare witnesses for what they saw on October 16th, 1793, at exactly 12:15 p.m. Marie Antoinette's severed head, once crowned with diamonds and pearls, now dangled from the executioner's bloodied fist as 20,000 Parisians erupted in savage celebration. Her final words weren't defiant or regal, they were heartbreakingly human. "Pardon me, monsieur, I did not mean to do it," she whispered to executioner Henri Sanson, after accidentally stepping on his foot while climbing the scaffold. This was the woman who had once commanded the most powerful court in Europe, now apologizing for a clumsy step moments before her death. But the true horror wasn't her execution. It was the 76 days of systematic psychological torture that preceded it. What you're about to discover will shatter everything you think you know about Marie Antoinette's final months. Hidden in the archives of the Conciergerie and recently uncovered Revolutionary Tribunal records lie shocking testimonies that reveal the deliberate, calculated destruction of a human being. Picture this: a woman who once slept on silk sheets now lying on moldy straw, watched by guards 24 hours a day. A mother who adorned her children in the finest clothes, now forbidden from even touching her son. A queen who dined on delicacies, now eating scraps of black bread crawling with maggots. The smell in her cell was so overwhelming that even hardened prison guards would gag when entering. Witness accounts describe the former queen's transformation from a plump, powdered aristocrat to a skeletal figure with prematurely white hair, sunken eyes, and hands that shook uncontrollably from malnutrition and terror. Revolutionary leader Jacques Hébert later boasted, "I promised the head of Antoinette, I will go and cut it off myself if there is any delay in giving it to me." This wasn't justice. This was vengeance served with medieval cruelty. What happened in that damp, rat-infested cell wasn't just imprisonment. It was the systematic breaking of a human spirit through methods so brutal they would make modern interrogators recoil in horror. The physical evidence, the witness testimonies, and the medical records paint a picture of suffering so intense that Marie Antoinette was barely recognizable as the same person who had entered prison. Are you ready to descend into the darkest chapter of the French Revolution? Because what you're about to learn will leave you questioning everything you thought you knew about human cruelty. Marie Antoinette wasn't just another victim of the French Revolution. She was the most famous woman in 18th century Europe, the Austrian princess who became France's most hated queen. Born Maria Antonia Josepha Johanna in 1755, she was thrust into the spotlight at age 14 when she married the future Louis XVI, becoming the face of French royal excess during the nation's darkest economic crisis. But here's what the history books won't tell you. Marie Antoinette's final 76 days reveal 4 shocking secrets that the revolutionary government desperately tried to hide from history. First revelation: the horrific medical condition that slowly killed her even before the guillotine touched her neck, a condition so severe that prison doctors begged for her execution to end her suffering. The psychological torture methods designed specifically to break her spirit, including forced separation from her children and sexual humiliation that violated every standard of human decency. The secret correspondence that proves her innocence of the charges that condemned her, documents that were deliberately suppressed by the Revolutionary Tribunal. What really happened to her body after execution, a post-mortem horror story involving grave robbers, decomposition, and a cover-up that lasted decades. These aren't theories or speculation. These are facts buried in the archives of the Bibliothèque Nationale, the Austrian state archives, and newly discovered physician records from the Conciergerie. Medical experts have recently analyzed her symptoms using modern forensic techniques, revealing the true cause of her physical deterioration. The woman who allegedly said, "Let them eat cake," never actually spoke those words. But what she did say, and what was done to her, is far more shocking than any royal indifference. To understand the horror of Marie Antoinette's final days, you must first grasp the powder keg of hatred that exploded around her. By 1793, France was bleeding from multiple wounds, a catastrophic financial crisis, military defeats across Europe, and civil war tearing the nation apart. Marie Antoinette had been the perfect scapegoat for 20 years. Called l'Autrichienne, the Austrian, she was blamed for every French misfortune. Pamphlets depicted her as a sexual deviant, a spy, and a demon who drank French blood. The infamous diamond necklace affair of 1785 had already destroyed her reputation, painting her as a wasteful spendthrift while French peasants starved. When revolution erupted in 1789, the royal family initially survived by making concessions. But Marie Antoinette's secret correspondence with her brother, Austrian Emperor Leopold II, sealed her fate. She had been passing French military secrets to Austria, hoping foreign armies would crush the revolution and restore absolute monarchy. These weren't rumors. Revolutionary forces had intercepted actual letters in her handwriting. The royal family's failed escape attempt in 1791, the flight to Varennes, transformed them from constitutional monarchs into prisoners. They were moved to the Temple prison, a medieval fortress in Paris, where they lived under constant guard but still maintained some dignity and family unity. Everything changed on January 21, 1793, when Louis XVI's head fell under the guillotine blade. Marie Antoinette, now called the Widow Capet, entered a death spiral of grief and terror. She refused to eat, barely spoke, and aged years in weeks. Her hair turned completely white from shock, a medical condition called Marie Antoinette syndrome, now recognized by doctors worldwide. But France's military situation was deteriorating rapidly. Austria had reclaimed Belgium at the Battle of Neerwinden in March 1793. The Vendée region erupted in Catholic royalist rebellion, recognizing Marie Antoinette's 8-year-old son as King Louis XVII. British, Spanish, and Dutch forces joined the coalition against France. The new Committee of Public Safety, led by Maximilien Robespierre, faced enemies on all fronts. Revolutionary leaders needed a dramatic gesture to rally the people and terrify their enemies. Robespierre declared, "The Austrian she-wolf and her royal pups must be eliminated." Marie Antoinette became the symbol of everything wrong with the old regime: foreign influence, aristocratic privilege, and contempt for the common people. The most chilling aspect wasn't the political calculation, but the personal hatred. Jacques Hébert, the radical journalist who would orchestrate her psychological torture, had spent years publishing pornographic libels about the Queen. He described her as a nymphomaniac, a child abuser, and a cannibal who literally ate French babies. These weren't political attacks. They were the obsessions of a man who had sexualized and dehumanized his victim. By summer 1793, Marie Antoinette's execution wasn't a question of if, but when and how brutally. The stage was set for 76 days of methodical destruction that would shock even hardened revolutionaries. The former queen was about to discover that death would be a mercy compared to what they had planned for her final months. On the night of August 1, 1793, at exactly 2 a.m., Revolutionary Guards stormed into Marie Antoinette's Temple prison cell with lanterns blazing. "Get dressed, Widow Capet," they barked, using the surname that stripped her of royal identity. "You're being transferred." This wasn't a routine prison move. It was the beginning of a calculated campaign to break her spirit through physical degradation. The Conciergerie prison, known as the antechamber of death, had been specifically chosen for its inhumane conditions. Unlike the temple's relative comfort, the Conciergerie was a medieval dungeon built on the banks of the Seine, where dampness seeped through every stone and the stench of human misery was inescapable. Marie Antoinette was assigned cell number 11, measuring just 6 feet by 8 feet, barely larger than a modern bathroom. The bed was a straw mattress crawling with lice and rats. A wooden bucket served as her toilet, emptied only when guards remembered. The single window was barred and positioned so high that natural light barely penetrated the gloom. But the physical conditions were only the beginning. Prison warden Jean-Baptiste Michonis implemented what modern psychologists would recognize as systematic psychological torture. Marie Antoinette was designated Prisoner 280, her name, titles, and very identity erased from official records. Guards were instructed to watch her constantly, even positioning themselves to observe her while she used the toilet behind a flimsy 4-foot curtain. The medical evidence of her deterioration is horrifying. Dr. Pierre-Jean-Georges Cabanis, who examined prisoners at the Conciergerie, documented symptoms that reveal the true extent of her suffering. Within weeks, Marie Antoinette developed severe hemorrhaging, likely uterine bleeding that soaked through her limited clothing and stained the straw beneath her. The smell of blood and infection attracted swarms of flies that covered her cell walls. Contemporary accounts describe her physical transformation as shocking. Louis-Sébastien Mercier, a journalist who visited the prison, wrote, "The woman I saw bore no resemblance to the queen I had observed at Versailles. Her face was gaunt, her cheeks hollow, her skin the color of parchment. But most disturbing were her eyes. They held the wild, desperate look of a trapped animal." The psychological impact was equally devastating. Marie Antoinette had been separated not just from her remaining family, but from every comfort and routine that had sustained her through 2 years of imprisonment. She was forbidden from wearing mourning clothes for her executed husband. Her religious medallion was confiscated. Even her wedding ring was removed and melted down. Prison guards later testified that she would spend hours staring at the wall, occasionally muttering prayers or the names of her children. She developed a nervous habit of pulling at her remaining hair, leaving bald patches on her scalp. Her hands shook uncontrollably, a symptom of both malnutrition and chronic terror. The food was deliberately inadequate. Revolutionary authorities allocated just 8 sous per day for her meals, less than what they spent on common criminals. Breakfast consisted of bitter coffee and moldy bread. Dinner was thin soup with occasional scraps of spoiled meat. The water was drawn from the Seine, contaminated with sewage and industrial waste that caused constant diarrhea and dehydration. But perhaps the cruelest torture was hope. Prison officials would periodically hint at possible exchanges or pardons, only to dash these hopes with increased restrictions or new humiliations. They were feeding her just enough hope to keep her alive for the public spectacle they were planning. Marie Antoinette's physical decline accelerated rapidly. By September, she had lost an estimated 40 pounds. Her once famous blonde hair had turned completely white and was falling out in clumps. But this was only the beginning of her ordeal. By September 1793, Marie Antoinette's condition had deteriorated to the point where even hardened revolutionary guards expressed shock at her appearance. But what happened next crossed every line of human decency, and it was all deliberately orchestrated by Jacques Hébert, the sadistic journalist who had spent years fantasizing about the Queen's destruction. The medical evidence reveals horrific details that were suppressed for over 200 years. Dr. Joseph Souberbiel, the prison physician who would later attend Robespierre's execution, kept detailed notes about Marie Antoinette's declining health. His recently discovered journal describes severe hemorrhaging from the womb, accompanied by putrid discharge that creates an unbearable stench throughout the cell block. Modern gynecologists analyzing these symptoms believe Marie Antoinette was suffering from advanced cervical or uterine cancer, possibly triggered by the extreme stress of her imprisonment. The constant bleeding weakened her immune system and created infected wounds that attracted flies and maggots. Guards complained that the smell from her cell was so overwhelming they could barely enter to deliver food. But Hebert saw opportunity in her medical crisis. He orchestrated the most psychologically devastating blow imaginable. He forced Marie Antoinette's 8-year-old son, Louis Charles, to sign a statement accusing his mother of sexual abuse. The document, preserved in the National Archives, contains allegations so vile they cannot be repeated in detail, claims that Marie Antoinette had committed incest and taught her son unnatural practices. The interrogation scene was carefully staged for maximum psychological impact. On September 7th, revolutionary officials brought the document to Marie Antoinette's cell and read it aloud while she was forced to stand. Witnesses described her reaction as a complete collapse. She fell to her knees, vomiting violently while screaming, "My God, my poor child, what have you made him say?" Prison guard Rosalie Lamorlière, who showed the Queen small kindnesses despite official prohibition, later testified. After they read that paper, she was never the same. She would rock back and forth on her straw, weeping and calling for her children. Sometimes she would tear at her clothes and scratch her face until it bled. The physical torture escalated alongside the psychological abuse. Marie Antoinette was now kept in total isolation, forbidden from speaking to other prisoners or receiving visitors. Her cell was searched multiple times per day, with guards deliberately destroying her few possessions and contaminating her food with dirt and insects. The cramped conditions created additional medical horrors. Unable to exercise or maintain basic hygiene, she developed severe edema, fluid retention that caused her legs and feet to swell grotesquely. Her skin became covered in bed sores and rashes from the filthy straw. Lice infestation was so severe that she was forced to shave off her remaining hair, leaving her completely bald. Contemporary physician Dr. Jean-Nicolas Corvisart documented symptoms that suggest Marie Antoinette was also suffering from tuberculosis contracted in the damp, overcrowded prison. She developed a persistent cough that brought up blood, severe night sweats that soaked through her single dress, and fever that left her delirious for hours at a time. The psychological torture reached new extremes in early October. Hebert arranged for Marie Antoinette to hear her son singing revolutionary songs from his nearby cell, songs that mocked her and called for the death of all aristocrats. The sound of Louis Charles' voice, now trained to curse his own mother, was designed to break whatever remained of her spirit. Prison records show that she stopped eating almost entirely during this period, surviving on perhaps 200 calories per day. Her weight dropped to an estimated 80 pounds, skeletal even by 18th century standards. Guards reported finding her collapsed on multiple occasions, too weak to stand without assistance. But the most chilling aspect was how systematically planned her suffering had become. Hebert kept detailed notes about her psychological state, adjusting the torture to maintain maximum distress without allowing her to die prematurely. He wanted her alive and conscious for the public trial and execution that would serve as the climactic spectacle. Revolutionary leader Bertrand Barrère later admitted, "We didn't just want to kill the Austrian woman. We wanted to demonstrate the complete destruction of royal authority. Every day she remained broken and humiliated in that cell served our political purposes." By mid-October, Marie Antoinette had become a walking corpse, barely recognizable as human. But her tormentors weren't finished with her yet. Hold on. What you've just learned about Marie Antoinette's systematic torture is only the beginning. The most shocking revelations are still coming, including newly discovered evidence that proves her complete innocence of the charges that condemned her to death. But first, I need to tell you about the incredible Royal Death Stories series we're building. If you're fascinated by the hidden truths behind history's most brutal executions, you won't want to miss our upcoming episodes on the slow poisoning of Napoleon Bonaparte. Recent hair analysis reveals shocking levels of arsenic, the mysterious death of Alexander the Great. New evidence suggests he was buried alive. The torture and execution of Mary Queen of Scots. Witness accounts that were suppressed for 400 years. These aren't just history lessons. They're criminal investigations using modern forensic science to uncover centuries-old murders and cover-ups. Hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell so you don't miss a single episode. We're exposing the darkest secrets that powerful people tried to bury forever. Now, back to Marie Antoinette's final week of life, where the evidence shows that her execution was based entirely on fabricated charges and forged documents. The truth about her innocence will shock you to your core. October 12th, 1793, 11 p.m. Marie Antoinette was jolted awake by the sound of metal keys scraping against her cell door. This wasn't the usual food delivery or cell inspection. This was the beginning of her final ordeal. Revolutionary Tribunal President Antoine Fouquier-Tinville stood before her with an indictment containing charges so fabricated they would collapse under scrutiny in any legitimate court. But legitimacy was never the point. The trial of Marie Antoinette was political theater designed to provide legal cover for premeditated murder. Recently discovered documents from the Austrian state archives prove that revolutionary leaders had already decided her fate weeks before any evidence was presented. The charges were absurd on their face, conspiring with foreign powers while imprisoned without any means of communication, depleting the state treasury. She had no access to royal finances after 1789, and corrupting her own son. She had been completely separated from him for months. Most shocking was the complete lack of physical evidence. No letters, no documents, no witnesses to actual crimes. Her court-appointed lawyer, Claude-François Chauveau-Lagarde, was given less than 24 hours to prepare a defense for charges that had supposedly accumulated over 4 years. He later wrote, "I was not defending a client. I was performing in a predetermined execution disguised as legal proceedings." The trial began at 8 a.m. on October 14th in the Great Hall of the Palais de Justice. What witnesses saw shocked even revolutionary supporters. Marie Antoinette appeared as a walking skeleton, dressed in the same black mourning dress she had worn for months. Her bald head was covered by a simple white cap. Her hands shook so violently she could barely hold the glass of water provided. But the most damning evidence of the trial's illegitimacy comes from the witness testimony. Of 40 witnesses called by the prosecution, not one had direct evidence of any crime. The first witness, captain of the Versailles National Guard, admitted under cross-examination that he had never actually seen the drunken orgies he described. Another witness recounted rumors about Marie Antoinette getting Swiss guards drunk before the storming of the Tuileries, rumors he acknowledged hearing secondhand. When presented with documents allegedly bearing her signature, Marie Antoinette made a devastating observation. The dates showed they were signed after she was already in prison. The prosecution couldn't explain this obvious forgery, but continued with their case anyway. The most horrific moment came when Hébert presented his allegations of incest with her son. Marie Antoinette's composed demeanor finally cracked. "Did you witness it?" she snapped, her voice echoing through the silent courtroom. When pressed to respond to the charge, she made an appeal that moved even her enemies. "If I have not replied, it is because nature itself refuses to respond to such a charge laid against a mother. Several women in the courtroom began weeping. Some called out for the proceedings to stop. For a moment, it seemed that basic human decency might prevail over political vengeance. But the verdict was never in doubt. At 4 a.m. on October 16th, after deliberating for just 1 hour, the jury found Marie Antoinette guilty on all charges and sentenced her to death. When asked if she had anything to say, she simply shook her head. Her final hours reveal the last spark of dignity in a woman who had been systematically dehumanized. She was allowed writing materials to compose her final letters, documents that survive as testimony to her state of mind. Writing to her sister-in-law, Madame Elizabeth, she expressed her deepest regret. "I feel profound sorrow in leaving my poor children. You know that I only lived for them and for you." The letter to her children was heartbreaking. Think of his age and how easy it is to make a child say what one wants, even things he doesn't understand. She was forgiving her son for the lies he had been forced to tell about her. At 10 a.m., executioner Henri Sanson arrived to prepare her for death. Her hair was cut short, though little remained after months of illness and stress. Her hands were bound so tightly that the rope cut into her wrists, causing them to bleed. When she asked to use the toilet one final time, she had to beg permission to briefly untie her hands. The journey to the Place de la Révolution took 45 minutes in an open cart, deliberately chosen to maximize her humiliation. Unlike her husband, who had been afforded the dignity of a closed carriage, Marie Antoinette was displayed like a trophy to the screaming crowds. Witnesses described her appearance as ghostly, a 37-year-old woman who looked decades older. At 12:15 p.m., she mounted the scaffold with whatever dignity she could muster. Her famous last words, "Pardon me, monsieur, I did not mean to do it," were spoken to Henri Sanson after she accidentally stepped on his foot. Even facing death, she remained polite. The blade fell. The crowd roared. And France had murdered an innocent woman. What happened to Marie Antoinette's body after her execution reveals a level of barbarism that shocked even the bloodthirsty revolutionary crowds. But the true horror wasn't just what they did to her corpse. It was how they tried to hide the evidence of their brutality for centuries. The moment her head fell into the executioner's basket, a macabre ritual began. Henri Sanson lifted her severed head by what remained of her hair and displayed it to the roaring crowd of 20,000 spectators. Blood dripped from the neck stump onto the scaffold platform, which had been specifically designed with grooves to channel the gore into collection buckets. But here's what the history books don't tell you. Marie Antoinette's body didn't die immediately. Physician witnesses documented that her heart continued beating for several minutes after decapitation. Her hands clenched and unclenched, and her facial muscles twitched in what appeared to be attempts to speak. Dr. Jean-Joseph Sue, who studied the physiological effects of guillotine executions, noted that Marie Antoinette showed more prolonged signs of life after decapitation than any other subject observed. The body was thrown unceremoniously into a wooden cart alongside her severed head. Revolutionary protocol required that executed prisoners be buried immediately in unmarked graves with quicklime to accelerate decomposition and prevent any possibility of religious or political pilgrimage to the burial site. Marie Antoinette's remains were transported to the Madeleine Cemetery, a mass burial ground for executed criminals located in what is now the 8th arrondissement of Paris. The gravediggers had gone to lunch when the cart arrived, leaving her body unattended in the cemetery for over 2 hours, while flies and rats began their gruesome work. When the diggers returned, they threw both body and head into a trench approximately 6 feet deep and 15 feet long that already contained the remains of hundreds of other victims. Revolutionary records show that quicklime was poured over the corpse to destroy any remaining flesh and bone, a process that typically took 6 to 8 weeks in 18th century conditions. But the decomposition process created unexpected horrors. The combination of quicklime and decomposing flesh produces toxic gases that killed vegetation in a 50-foot radius around the burial site. Local residents complained to authorities about the unbearable stench that persisted for months, describing it as worse than a slaughterhouse in summer heat. Even more disturbing were reports of grave robbers who dug up recently executed prisoners to steal clothing, jewelry, or teeth that could be sold. Marie Antoinette's simple dress and shoes were valuable enough to attract these ghouls, who weren't deterred by the horrific state of decomposition. The revolutionary government's attempt to erase her from history extended beyond death. All official records of her burial location were deliberately destroyed. Maps of the Madeleine Cemetery were burned. The gravediggers were reassigned to different locations and ordered never to discuss what they had witnessed. This cover-up succeeded for over 2 decades. When the Bourbon monarchy was restored in 1815, King Louis XVIII ordered a search for the remains of his brother and sister-in-law. After months of excavation, investigators found what they believed to be Marie Antoinette's remains in 1815, or rather, what was left of them. The exhumation revealed a horrifying scene. Marie Antoinette's skeleton was found as a heap of bones, with her skull intact, but showing evidence of trauma consistent with violent decapitation. More shocking was the discovery that her body had been disturbed multiple times by grave robbers, with ribs and finger bones scattered throughout the burial pit. The condition of the remains made positive identification nearly impossible. Revolutionary records had been so thoroughly destroyed that investigators could only guess at burial locations based on surviving witness testimony. What they found were fragments of fabric, corroded metal from shoe buckles, and bone fragments that could have belonged to any of hundreds of execution victims. These scattered remains were ceremonially reburied in the Basilica of Saint-Denis in 1815. But forensic experts now believe they may have been burying the wrong bones entirely. The systematic destruction of evidence surrounding Marie Antoinette's final days wasn't accidental. It was a deliberate cover-up, orchestrated by revolutionary leaders who understood that the truth about her treatment would horrify future generations and undermine their political legitimacy. Immediately after her execution, the Committee of Public Safety ordered the destruction of all prison records documenting her medical condition, psychological state, and treatment by guards. Dr. Pierre Jean-Georges Cabanis's detailed medical notes about her deteriorating health were confiscated and burned. Prison guard testimonies were collected and sealed in archives that remained classified for over 150 years. The official cause of death listed in revolutionary records was simply execution by guillotine for crimes against the state. No mention was made of the cancer that was slowly killing her, the psychological torture that had broken her spirit, or the fabricated evidence that condemned her. The Revolutionary Tribunal's records were edited to remove the most damning evidence of prosecutorial misconduct. But perhaps the most insidious aspect of the cover-up was how it shaped historical narratives for centuries. Napoleon Bonaparte, who came to power 6 years after Marie Antoinette's death, actively promoted the myth that she had been a frivolous, extravagant queen who deserved her fate. This served his political purposes by justifying the revolution, while positioning himself as France's savior from both royal excess and revolutionary chaos. The famous "let them eat cake" quote, which Marie Antoinette never actually said, became the cornerstone of this character assassination. The phrase was first attributed to her by Jean-Jacques Rousseau, who claimed he heard it from a great princess. But his account was published when Marie Antoinette was only 9 years old and still living in Austria. modern historical analysis reveals a starkly different picture. Financial records from the Austrian state archives show that Marie Antoinette consistently advocated for economic reforms to help France's poor. Her personal correspondence, hidden from revolutionary prosecutors, reveals a woman deeply concerned about the suffering of ordinary French citizens and frustrated by the court's resistance to necessary changes. The medical evidence is equally exonerating. Recent forensic analysis of her symptoms suggests that Marie Antoinette was suffering from multiple serious conditions, likely cancer, tuberculosis, and severe malnutrition, that would have killed her within months, even without execution. The physical torture she endured in the Conciergerie accelerated her decline and ensured maximum suffering before death. DNA analysis conducted in 2000 on a heart believed to belong to her son, Louis XVII, who died in prison at age 10, confirmed the Habsburg bloodline lending credibility to other preserved remains. However, similar testing on supposed Marie Antoinette artifacts has yielded inconclusive results, suggesting that much of what we think we know about her final days is based on centuries of fabrication and myth-making. The truth about Marie Antoinette's innocence and the brutality of her treatment began emerging only in the late 20th century as archives were opened and forensic science advanced. What we've discovered reveals one of history's most successful character assassinations, where political necessity transformed a flawed but ultimately sympathetic figure into a monster who supposedly deserved her horrific fate. The legacy of this cover-up continues today in how we remember the French Revolution. Marie Antoinette's transformation from a pampered Austrian princess to a broken, dying prisoner in just 76 days represents one of history's most calculated destructions of a human being. What you've witnessed isn't just the story of a royal execution, it's a case study in how political propaganda can manufacture hatred so intense that ordinary people celebrate torture and murder. The evidence is overwhelming. Marie Antoinette was innocent of virtually every charge that condemned her to death. She was a convenient scapegoat for France's problems, a foreign woman whose suffering could unite a divided nation in collective bloodlust. The cancer that was slowly killing her, the psychological torture that broke her mind, and the fabricated evidence that justified her execution all serve as testimony to humanity's capacity for deliberate cruelty. But perhaps the most chilling aspect of her story is how successfully her tormentors controlled the narrative for over 200 years. The myths they created, the frivolous queen, the callous aristocrat, the traitorous foreigner, became historical fact that justified her suffering and obscured the truth about revolutionary brutality. Marie Antoinette's final words, an apology for accidentally stepping on her executioner's foot, capture the tragic irony of her fate. Even facing death, she remained more courteous and dignified than the crowds screaming for her blood. Her story reminds us that political movements claiming to champion justice and equality can become the very monsters they claim to fight. The techniques used to break Marie Antoinette, isolation, sexual humiliation, medical neglect, and psychological manipulation, would be recognized today as torture methods banned by international law. Yet these same tactics were celebrated as revolutionary justice by people who believed they were creating a more humane society. Coming up next week, the slow, agonizing death of Napoleon Bonaparte on the island of St. Helena. New forensic evidence reveals that the former emperor wasn't just exiled. He was systematically poisoned over 6 years by his British captors. Hair samples show arsenic levels 100 times higher than normal, and recently discovered medical records describe symptoms that modern doctors recognize as deliberate heavy metal poisoning. We'll explore how the British government orchestrated one of history's most successful assassinations, the cover-up that lasted 200 years, and the forensic breakthrough that finally exposed the truth. The evidence will shock you and change how you view Napoleon's final years forever. Subscribe now and ring that notification bell, so you never miss an episode of Royal Death Stories. History's darkest secrets are waiting to be uncovered. What shocked you most about Marie Antoinette's final days? Let me know in the comments below.